Today's topic is John Constable and English landscape painting. Studying the English painter John Constable is helpful in understanding the changing meaning of nature during the Industrial Revolution in Britain. He is in fact largely responsible for reviving the importance of landscape painting in the 19th century. And this is a key event when we remember, of course, that landscape would become the primary subject matter of the French Impressionists later in the century. Landscape had a brief moment of glory before Constable among the Dutch masters of the 17th century. But, as we study so far, in the 18th century, the hierarchy of subject matter determined by the Royal Academy placed landscape near the lowest rung in the ladder of genres, right? Only still life painting was considered to be less important, which is why, up until this point, we've largely studied portraits and history paintings, the sort of top of the hierarchy of genres according to the Royal Academy. This would change in the first decades of the 19th century when Constable began to depict his father's farm on oversized 6-foot-long canvases. These 6-footers, as they were called, challenged the status quo. Here, landscape was presented on the scale, right, the literal scale, the canvas size, and thus importance of history painting. Why would Constable take such a bold step, and perhaps more to the point, why were his canvases celebrated? And they were celebrated by no less an important figure than Eugène Delacroix when Constable's The Hay Wain, which you see on your screen, was exhibited at the Paris Salon in France in 1824. Now, the Hay Wain does include an element of genre painting, the depiction of a common or everyday scene. And we see that in the farmhand taking his horse and wagon, that's a wain, across a stream. But this action is minor, right? It takes up just a tiny bit of the real estate of the whole painting, although we'll talk about it a bit more, and seems to offer the viewer the barest of pretenses for what is virtually a pure landscape. Unlike the later Impressionists, Constable's large, polished canvases were painted not outdoors, but in his studio. His finished canvases were completed in his studios. But whereas most artists would sketch scenes in nature on paper before returning to the studio to paint, beginning in 1814, Constable began to bring canvases outside to paint directly from nature. This is an oil sketch for the Hay Wain, which you just saw and we'll return to. So this is the artist bringing a palette and paints outdoors to capture the scenes in front of him with fidelity, right? Adding to the sense of veracity and immediacy in his landscape paintings and inspiring future artists like those that would form the Barbizon School. This is a group of French artists who painted landscapes in a forest near Paris beginning in the 1830s, as well as the later Impressionists, right, a group that formed in the 1860s and finished their canvases sometimes outdoors. So Constable started this new procedure because he sought a high degree of accuracy in his paintings. For instance, in the finished Hay Wain, the wagon and track are all clearly and specifically depicted, right? He gets the tools exactly right. He gets the harness attached correctly. The trees in his paintings are all identifiable by species. And Constable was the first artist we know of in Western art who studied meteorology so that the clouds and the atmospheric conditions that he rendered were scientifically precise. Constable was thus clearly a product of the Age of Enlightenment and its increasing confidence in science and observable data. But Constable was also deeply influenced by the social and economic impact of the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the 19th century, even the largest European cities counted their population only in the hundreds of thousands. These were mere towns by today's standards, but this would change quite rapidly. The world's economies had always been based largely on agriculture. Farming was a labor-intensive enterprise, and the result was that the vast majority of populations in Europe lived in rural communities. The Industrial Revolution would reverse this ancient and established pattern of population distribution. Increasing industrial efficiencies meant widespread unemployment in the country, right? As farming techniques and procedures became more sophisticated, they needed fewer people to work the land. There was this widespread unemployment and a great migration to the cities. The cities of London, Manchester, which you see on the screen, Paris, and New York doubled and then doubled again during the 19th century. Imagine the stresses on a modern-day New York if we had even a modest increase in population, right? Much less the population doubling, right? The stresses on sewers, the stresses on schools, the stresses on housing. So this can kind of give you some hint at the beginnings of the stresses of this big shift which took place in the 19th century. Industrialization remade virtually every aspect of society. Based on the political, technological, and scientific advances of the Age of Enlightenment, blessed with a bountiful supply of the inexpensive, albeit filthy, fuel and coal and advances in metallurgy and steam power, the northwestern nations of Europe invented the world that we now know in the West, right? We still, in many ways, especially, in our Oklahoma economy, which is still fueled in many ways by oil, right? We still live in the industrial world. One of these results of these shifts in science and economic patterns were huge changes to and an explosion of urban culture. Expectations of leisure, the explosion of the middle class, all resulted from industrialization. But the transition was quite brutal for the poor. Housing in cities like London and Manchester was miserable, unventilated, and often dangerously hot in the summer. Unclean water spread disease rapidly, and there was minimal health care. Corruption was high, pay was low, and hours inhumane. As is still true in much of the world today, families would depend on the labor of even very young children. Working long days with only Sundays off was quite normal, right before labor laws were enacted. The contemporaneous author Charles Dickens famously chronicled the depravity of pure market capitalism that characterized this era. There were no laws to soften this harsh new world. No unemployment insurance, no health insurance, no unions, no benefits, no vacations, no retirement, no age restrictions on work, right? No few safety regulations, and no child labor or bankruptcy protections. If you couldn't pay a debt because you had been sick or lost your job, you were often sent to prison. The wealth created by the rich, factory owners, and industrial farm owners was largely theirs to keep, as a permanent national income tax would not become law in Britain until 1874, and in the U.S. even later, 1913. Terrible labor abuses were answered by both calls for reform and revolution. Radicals and middle-class reformers slowly forced change. In 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels co-authored a pamphlet that would become enormously influential, the Communist Manifesto, while revolts raged in 1848 in England and France, and to a lesser extent, Germany. It's no surprise that France and England were particularly hard hit, and in fact, France experienced a violent regime change in 1848, as these two countries were the most industrialized nations at this point. Some art historians have suggested that Constable was responding to these shifts. As the cities and their problems grew, the urban elite, or those who had grown rich from an industrial economy, began to look to the countryside, not as a place so wretched with poverty that thousands were fleeing for an uncertain future in the city, but rather as an idealized version of pastoral England, a kind of nostalgic past or an escape. The rural landscape became a lost Eden, a place of one's childhood where good air and water, the open spaces, and hard and honest work of farm labor created a moral and open space that contrasted sharply with the perceived evils of modern industrial life. Constable's art therefore functions as an expression of the increasing importance of rural life, at least from the perspective of these wealthy urban elite for whom these canvases were intended and sold to. The Haywain is a celebration of a simpler time, right? A precious and moral place lost to the city dweller. Old-style, rural Tories believed that society and economic stability of England still depended on agriculture in these rural spaces. It's embarrassing to admit that this concerned the problem of the poor. Right, that these rural spaces had these harsh economic realities, right? These rural laborers that were edged out of increasingly industrialized farms, as we began to see, right, in the painting of Mr. and Mrs. Andrews by Gainsborough. So the problem of the rural poor was present and urgent in the early 19th century at this moment of industrialization. So there was this need, art historians have interpreted, for Constable to reduce their size, right, to put some distance between the figures in his paintings and the viewer, painting them quite indistinctly to evade issues of actuality, right, the likely tattered nature of their clothing, right, or the lines on their faces. So this is one strategy of Constable's that we can read in his painting, this sort of distancing. While he's going for meteorological accuracy, right, and accuracy in depicting the harnesses on the horses, he doesn't want to depict the rural working poor with such a sharp eye. So at this moment, landscape painting became popular and important to art collectors in the cities, but the ideal of the close rural community had replaced the experience or reality of it. Constable does not picture vagrants, right? He does not invite sympathy for outcasts or these rural laborers. If we were to construct a Venn diagram comparing the similarities and differences of Constable's Haywain with Gainsborough's landscape with a woodcutter and milkmaid from 1755, we would say that both are adapting the old Georgic vision of England. England as rich and peaceful, a land where labor is valued and rewarded. Both are adapting this vision to a time in which that those very concepts were threatened by a new fear of the power of the laboring classes, right? Marx's Communist Manifesto, encouraging laborers, right, to seize their power. These this kind of looming threat by the massive populations of rural laborers who were losing their way of life, losing their livelihood. This was the exact moment when these paintings, these peaceful images, were constructed. In Gainsborough's work, he represents rural laborers in an idyllic fashion, right? This is not meant to capture a reality that Gainsborough witnessed, but a kind of ideal with ideal types. So in the middle ground, we have a plowman. He's virtuous, he's devoted and concentrated in his work, right? Pulling the plow. And that is set into a kind of moral contrast to the idleness of a couple who's able to rest for a moment, right? Relax and engage in some sort of flirtation, right? This moment, right, when Gainsborough makes this painting in 1755, aristocratic wealth was still largely concentrated in land ownership. And so these landowners would have really taken to this nostalgic and sentimental vision of rural life, right? A kind of vision that prioritized emotion and nostalgia over reason. Constable's work, however, right, demonstrated its dedication to minute observation, right, the scientific study of clouds and trees. There's more specificity given to the worker pulling the hay wain, to the landscape, and we'll also see this kind of fidelity in the next painting. With Wivenhoe Park, Essex, Constable depicted an English country estate in order to make a broader statement about its owner and his relationship with nature at this moment in the early 19th century. Major General Francis Slater Ribot owned Wivenhoe Park, a quiet countryside estate approximately 70 miles northeast of London. Ribot was friends with the corn merchant Golding Constable, who was John Constable's father. The wealthy officer was one of John Constable's first patrons. And so there's this sort of socioeconomic alignment, right? This sort of identification between Constable and this patron, much like we saw with Gainsborough and Mr. Andrews, right? They sort of wanted to be or were in the same class. They had their interests aligned. The 200-acre estate at Wivenhoe was the pride of Major General Ribot's father-in-law, Colonel Isaac Martin Ribot. Interestingly, and this is a interesting footnote for you, the Major General took his wife's last name after their marriage. So Isaac Ribot purchased the land in the 1730s and commissioned the construction of Wivenhoe House in 1759. He then made massive alterations to it in the 1770s, in addition to the surrounding parkland designed by the landscape architect Richard Woods. Wivenhoe's park's grounds were redesigned along the lines of the quality or the idea called the picturesque. And the picturesque sounds like a pretty broad descriptor, but it actually has a very specific meaning in the 18th and 19th centuries. So the idea or the aesthetic of the picturesque was made fashionable in the late 18th century by the travel logs of Reverend William Gilpin. And you see a sketching, an illustration of Gilpin's travel logs here. This is plate 3 from his Essays on Picturesque Beauty from 1792. This kind of travel log was connected to tourism, and Gilpin helped show how one looks as a tourist of the countryside, how you survey nature, what aesthetic qualities you were meant to take pleasure in, enjoy, and seek out as a tourist. I'm showing you two images from another travel log, this by Girton. The aesthetic of the picturesque involves irregular outlines, variegated surfaces, often a serpentine path going through the landscape. So not sort of the straight line of a well-planned road, but that curving snake-like serpentine line that you see the river making in these two images, or the path in Gilpin's image before this. The picturesque often involved small figures in the foreground, showing the viewer how a visitor could sort of navigate in this very sort of easy way these surprising textures of a landscape, these spaces that offered moments of surprise and cultivated to look quite wild, right? This was, again, not meant to offer kind of sharp lines, but instead curving surfaces, elements of wildness. The picturesque celebrated ruins, and you're seeing two images of a ruined abbey here. So the picturesque is a kind of artificial aesthetic, right? Especially when you design your park grounds as the picturesque. But it's a kind of non-threatening and nostalgic aesthetic. We can also think of the picturesque, this 19th century aesthetic, as being present in Central Park in New York, if you've ever been there. The paths are winding and serpentine, right? There aren't sort of direct, long paths from one place to another. There's different qualities of wood and grass that you can sort of meander through and discover. There's boulders and rocks, not quite ruins. This is the aesthetic that was popularized at this moment. So how can we see the picturesque in Constable's paintings of Wivenhoe? Well, here, in order to evoke a sense of the picturesque, the landscape architect Woods introduced an archway and a bridge specifically designed to look old, right? This sort of nostalgic view. I'll show you a detail of that on the next slide. He provides multiple curving roads lined with trees. He digs out two new lakes for fishing and boating. So Ribot's estate was a prime example of the celebration and construction of the picturesque in England, and a source of pride for the entire family. It was a vision of rural beauty and simplicity and harmony. And I'm just showing you briefly the landscape architecture from 19th century England, this picturesque aesthetic, in contrast to other aesthetic or landscape options. So on the right, again briefly, you just see the palace, the grounds of the Palace of Versailles. We're looking out from the roof of the palace here. So it's sort of celebrating straight lines and the mastery, man's mastery over the landscape, right? Nature has been cultivated very carefully. Man's mastery over nature is shown to the carefully manicured bushes, the mazes, the straight lines, this lake that's been carved out in a neat geometric rectangle. So this is a very different aesthetic than the picturesque. Wivenhoe, the grounds here, are the interventions are sort of just as extreme, right? These lakes were also dug out, the trees were also planted, but they were planted in a way to look natural, this sort of artificial wildness or naturalness. So this was a vision of rural beauty and simplicity, that rural spaces were wilder, right, and closer to nature. This is what the landscape was meant to emphasize. And Constable reflects this aesthetic by even reducing the mansion, right, the jewel of this family's estate, to a tiny spot on the landscape, right, wiped out by a tree. So there weren't grand, long vistas that you were meant to admire the house in, but the house was part of the discovery, right, was a sort of pleasure at the end of this meander through nature. And Constable was deeply invested in the physical experience of nature. His paintings possess a strong sense of the particular and demonstrate a keen artist's eye turned to the environment, right? He famously studied weather reports and spent countless hours sketching clouds, which he renders in precise meteorological detail in the painting Wivenhoe Park, Essex. In the early 19th century, meteorology was quite a new science that Constable embraced for his artistic purposes. Similarly, the play of light and shadow across the right foreground and the glimmers of light reflected off the pond in the middle of the composition enhance the sense of a real observed landscape, right? Sort of scientific verisimilitude. So this painting, like many of Constable's works, was an expressive recollection of a fantasized union between the self and nature, a kind of nostalgic connection to both nature and Constable's regional identity. We also see this scientific and methodical description of the land and tools and clouds, reading landscape as a form of knowledge. So this mix of observational detachment, right, this kind of scientific detachment, and deep personal investiture, right, this very sense of personal identification with the landscape, is fundamental to the understanding and achievement of Constable's landscape painting practice. These broad principles can also be seen in the details. Here I'm showing you a detail from the painting where we see Mary Rebo, the 11-year-old daughter of the Major General, is on the left. This is from the left side of the canvas, and she is driving a little donkey cart on the property. The red scarf, one of the girl's favorite accessories, is a little flash of color in a composition otherwise dominated by greens and blues and browns, right? So here again we have nostalgia, right, and sentimentality mixed with empirical observation in Constable's work. Less than 2 years after completing Wivenhoe Park, Essex, Constable embarked on the process of painting a series of monumental landscapes of the Stour River Valley, known as the Six-Footers, a name which referred to the width of his canvases. The Hay Wain was one of these, and at 40 years of age, when he married Maria Bicknell in 1816, Constable was seeking the honor of the election to the Royal Academy, right, that we saw led for a time by Sir Joshua Reynolds. This was, of course, the surest indicator of professional success for an artist working in England, so he wanted to be part of that club. Wivenhoe Park, Essex serves as a precursor to those massive canvases, allowing the artist to practice organizing a series of complex landscape details, vignettes of daily life that you see here, and a visceral, precise depiction of elements like the sun, the wind, trees, and clouds into a coherent composition. This is one of those 6-footers, those large-scale canvases, Constable's view on the Stour near Dedham. And this, again, is 6 feet across, a scale that had been appropriate for history painting, but not landscape, when Constable made this. So he's making a statement about the importance of this scene. And the scene, of course, is not biblical. It's not of a Roman subject, but instead it's a contemporary subject and a scene from Constable's native region, Suffolk. It's a specific image, right? Constable communicates a specific time of day, an identifiable season, an identifiable place, so not the kind of generic idea of a landscape. And again, he was the first artist to take the weather seriously and to paint specific foliage. If you go back to your Gainsborough portraits, right, with that sort of wild landscape behind the sitters, you won't be able to identify necessarily, right, oak leaves from other kinds of leaves, right? That wasn't the sort of point or the place where the artist was putting his energy. We also have specific weather here. Again, these will all be important to the French Impressionists that will come a couple decades after this. In the left corner of the painting, we see a storm either approaching or just passing with sort of darkened clouds in the upper left. This is a landscape, right? Most of the real estate of the canvas is dedicated to landscape, but it is filled with little vignettes. There are men pushing and pulling, maneuvering their barges past one another. So men at work. There are also women. There's a woman carrying a baby across the bridge in that middle ground. Another woman doing her washing by the river. Another two about to cross the bridge. There's a sailboat further on in the middle ground, moving across the river. Beyond that sail, you can see a church tower in the background. Churches for Constable and many of his contemporaries signaled the kind of timeless cycles ordained by God, right? Associating the countryside with a more spiritual group of people and a more sort of timeless way of life. The kind of barges that we see in the foreground that these men are pushing, however, would soon be replaced by a train, right? Instead of moving goods out to and from the countryside by these small boats driven by these men, they would soon be replaced by trains with their industrial sense of speed. So this signals in a way, right, the future unrest in the countryside because of the Industrial Revolution. These are jobs that would be quickly displaced by industrial machinery, by the train. So there was this sort of underlying fear for the future of England with these monumental changes taking place. Constable's own father was afraid of these changes, we know. So again, we see this personal nostalgia for this place that Constable grew up, and a specific kind of nostalgia for an England that he felt was disappearing. Salisbury became a space of personal significance for Constable also. It's part of the Suffolk region. He visited the small city in the west of England in 1811 on the invitation of the Bishop of Salisbury, one of his most important patrons. And over the years, he made more trips, making over 300 paintings and watercolors of this area. So this is a space of personal significance. And we see here a scene of Salisbury from the Bishop's Garden, right? From a site of personal significance between Constable and his friend, the Bishop. And this was all the more poignant in 1823 because a year after this painting was exhibited, the Bishop died at age 44. Painting rural churches at this moment, it's not as sort of simple and saccharine as it might appear, however, as we see in this caricature from 1829. This image refers to the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829 that allowed Catholics to sit in Parliament, so to serve in political positions. This, we might think today, was a pretty, just and reasonable decision not to exclude parliamentarians based on their religion. Yet, as the caricature shows, not everyone agreed, including Bishop Fisher and John Constable. These folks saw the Catholic Emancipation Act as a kind of assault on the fabric of the British establishment. The latter, Constable, described it as the greatest mischief of the Wellington government. Perhaps this is why Constable painted the sky as he did in the painting of Salisbury Chapel, bearing ominously down on that masterpiece of religious architecture, right, the embodiment of the Church of England. So this caricature by William Heath from 1829 hints at what Fisher, the bishop, was getting at. In it we find the Prime Minister, Lord Wellington, and others pulling down the steeple of the church, representing the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, where a Catholic monk holds a lighted candle in one hand and trails of gunpowder from the other. So this monk is threatening to blow up the church as the political government pulls it down. So what are we to make of it? That Constable was religiously intolerant, right? A political reactionary, doggedly opposed to reform and the granting of rights to an oppressed minority. Probably, right? Most of this is true. But having abandoned Bishop Fisher's suggested title in favor of the less politically charged Salisbury Cathedral from the Meadows, rather than the Bishop's Garden, it seems equally likely that Constable was keen to avoid such a narrow reading of his work. So he understood, right, that by celebrating an Anglican church like Salisbury Cathedral would be understood in the context of political debates about the status of the church, but he didn't want so narrow a reading. Here in Salisbury Cathedral from the Meadows, we see Constable's painterly method up close. He used a palette knife and a brush, and the effects are really breathtaking. Few artists have shown such an extraordinary facility for capturing the textures of the natural world, right, with this mix of scientific fidelity and sentimentality. And it's really, in this image, the rainbow that captivates the viewer. The first rainbow in any of Constable's paintings. It did come as an afterthought, as x-rays of the paintings show. But a smart afterthought, right? Compositionally, it unites the various elements of this painting, softening the horizon, creating echoes, compositional echoes with the river and the undulating line of the large tree, and sort of connecting both the stormy and bright sides of the painting to which the horse and cart move. Again, this sort of sunny or blessed version of Salisbury Cathedral needs to be seen within its broader political context and as a kind of political statement on the side of the traditional importance of the Anglican Church. So both of these paintings straddle a period of massive economic reorganization in Britain. Remember that in Gainsborough's Mr. and Mrs. Andrews from the mid-18th century, we see a landowner, Mr. Andrews, presiding over a landscape that he owns and putting on display his modern techniques of agricultural technology. So we see land that's well maintained and prosperous, right? Those wheat bundles in the right foreground. We see crops being rotated in the background. So these are modern techniques that allow landowners to employ fewer and fewer laborers and to accumulate bigger scales of land and wealth. In Constable's landscapes, we see visions of stable English agriculture that were really under threat, more under threat at the moment in 1820 when he painted them. Constable wanted to show us a vision of a sort of permanently stunning nature and laborers that were happy and organized and at work. If you look closely at his workers in Stratford Mill, right, shirt sleeves are white, right? Everyone is in their place. He's showing the stability of an ideally structured economic and social order in rural spaces. He shows us tokens of calm and endless and anonymous industry, which confirm the order of rural society. This harmonious relationship between worker and land, however, is only available if distance is maintained. If Constable took such a precise and scientific eye to the workers in these rural spaces in 1820, he would see a much more divided and exhausted reality. But his goal, right, was to paint a myth of a kind of lost organic community at a moment when industry was really shifting. As long as these human figures are small and remote, we can invent a kind of happiness in them. So he's replacing experience, right? The experience of the lives of these figures with a kind of ideal. And this is the contradiction in John Constable's work. He was dedicated, obsessed with recording the change and flux of a specific landscape, right? How the clouds looked at a particular time of day in a particular season. But this was happening at once with a desire to freeze, right, the figures in his paintings in a kind of static, an economically and socially static time. And we study John Constable for this interesting contradiction, to illuminate this economic reality in the early 19th century, but also because he was this critically important precursor for Impressionism, recording a landscape at a particular time of day, right, in specific light and weather conditions was something, and bringing his canvases outdoors and just to work up oil sketches. These were important precursors for the French Impressionists.